Hello, everyone, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast and our 100th episode. Today is a very special episode, not only because it's the 100, but also it's about a topic that is very near and dear to our hearts. I had the great pleasure of chatting with three brilliant individuals, David Brint, Janet Szlyk, and Jack Schroeder, who were together involved in the creation of the Foglia residences, an affordable housing project designed with and for people with vision impairment. The developer of the residences is Brinshore Developer, of which David Brint is the principal and co-founder. Besides his role at Brinshore, David also serves as chairman of the board of directors for the Foundation for Fighting Blindness. Dr. Janet Szlyk is president and CEO of the Chicago Lighthouse, a 117-year-old not-for-profit organization helping people who are blind, visually impaired, and disabled. During her tenure, Janet has expanded the Lighthouse's social service programs, providing education, comprehensive vision care, independent living, employment services, and independent living skills training for clients of all ages. LBBA architects are behind the design of the Foglia residences. Jack Schroeder is a principal at LBBA, a team of socially minded architects providing engaging and empathetic solutions for affordable housing and community spaces in Chicago and beyond. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have a very special episode. We have three guests joining us, and all of them have a lot of great information to share with us today. We have Janet Szlyk joining us. She's the CEO of the Chicago Lighthouse. Welcome, Janet. We have David Brint joining us. He's the principal and co-founder of Brinshore Development. And we have Jack Schroeder joining us. He's the principal architect at LBBA. Welcome, everybody.
Hello.
Thank you for having us.
Okay. Thank you for joining. This is going to be a great conversation. I already know it. So I would really like just ask you to introduce yourselves very briefly and maybe give us a bit of information about your background and how you came to where you are today. Janet, would you like to go first?
I'll start. Yes, I'm president and CEO, as you said, of the Chicago Lighthouse. I've been with the Lighthouse for over a decade now, and my background is academics, and I come from diverse fields. The university, I am still a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Now I'm adjunct since I'm at the Lighthouse, but in the areas of ophthalmology and visual sciences and psychology and bioengineering are the departments that I taught within and had students in my research lab before coming to the Chicago Lighthouse. So it was the perfect place for me to spend the second half of my career because it is a diverse organization. We are the 117 years in the making as an iconic social service organization that also has a business enterprise that supports the social mission. Our main areas are in education, rehabilitation, and employment of people who are blind, visually impaired, disabled, and veterans. And it's a great place to be. This is our first venture into housing. We were led in that venture by David Brint, and who really, and we both have been feeling for a long time, I think since I came to the Lighthouse, that there was a need for affordable housing for people who are blind, beautiful, affordable housing. And we're finding out more now after doing this, and the word is getting out that there is a greater need. And we have a waiting list of hundreds of people who are eager to get into the building and become tenants in this wonderful project.
All right, thank you, David. That's a great segue to you.
Well, I'm David Brint. I'm a principal at Brinshore Development. We're headquartered here in the Chicago area, and we do affordable housing development around the country. We're in 20 states. We've been doing this for 32 years, I believe. We've done about 10,000 units of affordable housing. Our developments all are driven by affordable housing and include the unrestricted housing. So there's mixed income components and mixed use components. Our specialty is in looking and trying to do developments that are a constructive asset to the community, specifically looking at not only just housing needs, but what are the other needs in the community and trying to incorporate them into the housing, which one of the things that led us, and we'll tell you a little more about it soon, about our Foglia residence project in Chicago. But we work with public housing redevelopment and community redevelopment, like I said, around the country. We have about 35 people and have been in business for a little over 30 years.
Wonderful. And Jack?
Yeah, I have been with LBBA for a little over 20 years. Our focus is almost solely on affordable housing, permanent supportive housing, kind of community-based work. And this partnership has just been awesome. You know, we've been at this for, I think, almost 5 years now, you know, from the very, very early meetings. We've worked with David for a long time, obviously kind of newer to Lighthouse, but it's been a really rewarding, really educational process. So I'm excited to talk about it and share.
Awesome. I'm excited to talk about it too. And before going into that in detail, I do want to talk a little bit like overall about the housing. And maybe, David, we can start off with you because you've all sort of hinted out already some of the problems that we see. I guess, like, I'm based in New York City, right? To me, the problem is the lack of it, the lack of affordable housing, and not even, you know, like low income housing, but maybe mixed income housing, right? Like, that's my point of view here. So we start off with like financial inaccessibility, right, to housing, and then moving from there further on like more physical access, right, which is even more rare to see. And I'm not talking about you know, baseline ADA compliance that we need to comply with by regulation, but more so like creating more inclusive spaces. But David, why not, let's start with you first. I mean, you're in the field focused on affordable housing too. First off, like, where do you see we are at today?
Yeah, I'll try not to talk about for an hour because you probably could talk that long about issues that relate to housing shortage. Well, let's start with this. The simplest way to look at it is that housing costs have been climbing for the last 20 years. Material costs continue to go up and labor costs continue to go up, but people's incomes haven't gone up at the same rate. So it's not surprising that after 20 or 30 years of that the cost of the housing would significantly be greater than the affordability of the individuals that could buy or rent. That continues to today. Most of us have been screaming about that for 20 years, but generally it was lip service from the political arena. And truthfully, not that they have to do this. I mean, the government doesn't have to get involved in subsidizing housing, but now, since it's become so prolific, guess what? Everybody's looking to the government to try to solve the problem. And it's not an easy solution because you can't get housing built quickly. We have a labor shortage in the country. And so as a result, labor costs are significantly higher. And so we have all sorts of issues that relate to getting housing affordability. Even in marketplace where people are charging, you know, $3, $4, $5, $6 a foot for rent for an unrestricted marketplace, you know, the marketplace sort of takes care of itself, but costs go up as you ratchet down to affordability for people that are not wealthy or you know, have significant incomes. Finding affordable housing that is becoming very, very difficult. So when we look at things, typically we define affordable housing as below 80% of area median. So for example, in the Chicago area median for a family of 4 is about $85,000. So 80% of that is $65,000, $70,000 and below. And all the way down to folks that make closer to 30% of area median, which would be $25,000 for a family of 4. You know, people, if they're making $25,000, they can't afford anything. I mean, not only just to pay food and medical costs and some clothing, it's really very difficult for them. So the government gets involved usually in the lower levels. But now we're finding that middle income people are struggling to make ends meet. You know, if you have 2 kids and you have to pay, you know, $2,000 a month for rent, and you have transportation costs, and you have medical costs, and you have clothes, and you have other things that relate to your family. It's very difficult to make ends meet if you're making $70,000 a year. And I remember when I was younger, and I thought the idea of making $70,000 a year was all the money in the world. But nowadays, that's really not the case. And in areas, in cities now, many of them have seen this enormous increase in cost. And New York and Denver and Austin, Texas, and in Los Angeles and in Chicago and other cities, you've seen this. And then you see tertiary markets are starting to see the same kind of increases, because you get populations moving there because it was more affordable. So generally, everywhere in the country, we're seeing big affordable issues. And for the first time in the last 3 or 4 years, and the first time in 30 years that I've been doing this, affordable housing doesn't drive people out of the room when you bring it up. So it's become a more significant issue, and people want it solved in 15 seconds, and that's not the way housing goes. So we have a real challenge to solve this problem, and it's not going to be handled quickly.
Yeah. And then of course, like when you kind of like look at what's going on in the housing market, you're already like dealing with all these pieces, right? And let's say you finally, with all the battles, like you're making a project happen. And from there on, there is the tendency to do I would say the bare minimum, right? If you're going to deliver, because already putting everything together was so hard. So you're just like, let's just run with it and complete it. So it's very rare to see projects that are extremely thoughtful from there on. And I guess this could go into both like creating spaces that are better for community, but also, that is more environmentally friendly, right? So we're having this like challenge both in sustainability and inclusion in the built environment. And this particularly, like both like the financial aspect of it is an issue for the disability community, especially because this is a community that is also underemployed, right? And this, there's a lot of initiatives in all corporations to create more inclusion around like workplace environment too, but we also still have a lot of way to go. And I think, Janet, this would be like great to talk with you on, considering especially people with visual impairment and blind individuals. There is already, like challenges that is faced in the day-to-day physically, but also a lot of economic challenges as well, due to employment and having the need to create more inclusive workplaces. Do you want to touch upon that?
Yes. I mean, we could be here for a very long time talking about what is wrong, and what we need, but we're focusing on housing. And part of the inspiration for what we're doing is conversations with other nonprofit leaders that deal with disability. Karen Tamley from Access Living, I remember having conversations with her when she was commissioner for disabilities in Chicago, and she said that her office receives hundreds of calls weekly on trying to identify any housing options for those with disabilities and people in need of housing. And so we felt that something really needs to be done and in solving this problem. And Chicago Lighthouse, we like to think we're problem solvers. And David Brint was on our board, and we began the conversations then and continued. And we felt that, overall, we have people who are dropped off to us because the shelters, people who are homeless, I guess 25% of people on any given night have a disability, and a lot of them have visual disabilities. And in addition, to make the matter worse, people who are blind or visually impaired are not allowed in shelters, and because they are at risk. And to make, again, matters worse, there are only 3,000 beds in Chicago in shelters overall. So, and people who are blind are being pushed out. So we've had numerous people who are dropped off at the Lighthouse because people feel that we can help them. And of course we can, but it's an additional service we provide. We connect with other agencies like the Salvation Army to find a bed. or safe haven in Chicago. And this has become something else that we do. So we saw the problem there as well. So the commissioner's office, other nonprofits, and then the homelessness issue for people who are blind and visually impaired. So we've now begun going into some of the shelters and training staff so that at least 1 or 2 shelters in Chicago can be a blind-friendly shelter. But this is something that is unacceptable to humankind. And so with this building, hopefully we can see a significant number of tenants who are blind and visually impaired who will be living in this wonderful accessible housing, because only 5%, I saw a statistic of affordable housing is accessible. And we have a number of people in our community who are in wheelchairs that we serve that are also looking for housing. So there'll be some of the apartments, and Jack can comment on that as well, that will be accessible to people in wheelchairs. So it's all about accessibility, inclusion, identifying the problem, doing the market research, and seeing the significant need and solve the problem. So I think we have a great group of people together who are working to solve the problem and use this model nationally as a national template for how we were able to fund it. But I also want to give credit to the city of Chicago, because in 2020, when we submitted our application for funding, we submitted it in January and we got approval in March, which is unheard of. So the city also saw the significant need for this. And we will see it as the jewel of the Illinois Medical District, because we're in the heart of the medical district, and it will be the welcome center of the Illinois Medical District that we're very proud of.
Amazing. I hope we'll send this episode out to all city officials to set this as an example. But Jack, would you like to talk about a bit more in depth about the project itself? And by project, what do we mean? The project.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think starting with the process, David kind of brought us in with our existing relationship, and we met with Lighthouse to understand, the project as a whole, and understand that basically they have this great giant facility that serves all these great purposes, and then we're using this sliver of land that was the old parking lot. So in order to do so, we're kind of building up. Like Janet said, we're kind of, like you said, a gateway. It's going to be 76 units of housing. It's minimal parking. I'm trying to think of all the sort of layers to it. Some services within, but then also sharing services with Lighthouse. And pretty quickly, we jumped into understanding the need of blind and visually impaired people directly. We consulted with Chris Downey. That's an architect that specifically, his company is called Architecture for the Blind, and he advises on how best to serve this population. We worked with occupational therapy staff at Lighthouse. There's a lot of great publications. So our first step was to dig in and really learn. We consider ourselves pretty expert at general accessibility, but this was another level that we wanted to get to. So the whole building will serve really directly those with visual impairment and blindness. And I could run through some of those things, but that may be for another day. But yeah, I mean, did I hit the kind of high notes there? Trying to think of, yeah.
David, anything you would like to add to that?
Oh, let's see. You mentioned in your intro before about, you can just build housing and it doesn't create space and whatnot. There's a real balancing act that goes on when you talk about cost. And, anytime you add cost to a project, there are fewer units that you can build. So you have to try to figure out how to minimize your costs, but yet still create space. So when you talk about, eco-friendly components, they're costly. They may have a long-term benefit, but there has to be an upfront subsidy to pay for them. So, do you do that? You talk about, different kinds of materials, how they look. One may be obviously, split face block is cheap and it looks horrible. Do you want to create a building that looks like that? So we often try to create this balancing act. But in the case of this project, and I hope we will, Jack, talk a little bit more about it, it doesn't take a lot of cost to create the space that's needed for our population and for anybody entering that population. I mean, being sensitive to lighting and contrast, because it's not just all blind people. We serve visually impaired people too. So there's different degrees of visual loss. Only requires thoughtfulness, making textures through the building and other things, and we'll talk about it. Just creates a little, just it requires a little thoughtfulness, not a lot of cost. So there is a balancing act that goes on in affordable housing, because I know people will talk about the cost of affordable housing and, oh my God, it costs so much to do this housing. And it does. I mean, there's a lot of requirements, but it doesn't take so much to create space, to create a place.
Yeah, I think, David, that's a huge part of this. I think a huge takeaway for me is that the decisions we're making don't actually add cost and don't even impact the feel of the place. It's just good universal design. And I think that's been a big learning piece for us on this. Is I think you're right. People would just say, "Oh, we can't do it. It's a little too much. It's a little it's not code required." And I think my takeaway, among other things, would be just to include the stuff always in every unit, right? Not the 5%, not the 20%. I think it's really possible. And it's a lot of what we're doing is flexible. David, you talked about controlling light, and there's ways to do that a sighted person would never even know that the unit was was designed for someone with a visual impairment. I think it's a fascinating kind of journey that we've been on personally, just from a design standpoint, that these spaces can serve everybody and other needs too, like Janet mentioned.
It's easier living for everyone.
Right.
With aging vision too, you need these extra elements in your building design. So as Jack said, it's good for everyone. Having pathways that are indicated by stone or carpet, and that discriminate those pathways, that's helpful to everyone in getting to a destination or in wayfinding. And we're finding that this is generating so much enthusiasm that other nonprofits want to be involved and help in identifying and finding furniture and providing furniture. Designs for Dignity is helping us with furnishing some of the apartments and some of the public areas of the building. And there is a space that's going to be a beautiful event space that I love to talk about, because it will be a space to share this information and DEI concept. And it will also be a business area that will generate income for the building, where we can lease it out to the university to have seminars and luncheons and dinners and for visiting people to the university. So I think that that's important, and it will be a place for training people with disabilities to be event planners. So we make use of every area of space, creating career opportunities. There is retail space. It's not large. It's about 1,500 square feet. Is that true?
Yep.
So we're investigating different businesses within that space. But I can assure you that it'll be space that'll employ people with disabilities, whether it be a coffee shop or a dry cleaner or a market, a small market, which it seems to be what people would like to see there. But it will employ people with disabilities there. And as Jack said, people who live there will have the wraparound services of the Lighthouse and will be able to participate. And some may be employees of the Lighthouse. So right now we have 800 employees and 35% are people with disabilities. So that's a number that we're very proud of. And 26% of those individuals are in leadership positions, supervisory, management, and above. So we walk the talk, and we aim to use the same philosophy in our Foglia residences. And, we found that donors are also very much interested in the project because they see what the good that's being done. And Mr. Foglia and the Foglia Foundation have been very generous, and they aim to continue their generosity. Mr. Foglia, he built a business in medical supplies, and that began at the Cook County Hospital, at Stroger Hospital, which is right here in the center, also one of the hospitals within the district. And so he wanted to give back, and he's thrilled that the Foglia residences will be that gateway we've spoken about.
Pete, I don't know if you want to move on, but can I add one more thing?
Please, yes.
So this idea started when the Lighthouse makes a great effort to provide employment for people that are visually impaired, and we have an industries committee that I was involved with for years, and we make clocks and we make other things. The people that are visually impaired makes them, and we started a new initiative to do call centers, and so it grew. The business grew, and how many people are employed there now, Janet? 200?
600
and
are part of that business.
And a significant percentage of them are visually impaired, and 20 or 30%, or maybe more. I don't know how many. But one of the things that people don't realize is that 70% of people that are blind or visually impaired are unemployed. It's very difficult for them to gain employment. And one of the things we learned from our inability to get more blind or visually impaired people employed in our call centers was their ability to get to work. If they live on the far north side and they have to get to where the call centers are, it's not an easy path for many of them. And so it occurred to us, boy, if we could have affordable housing near where they work, it would be a natural conduit to giving them a full life, especially in a neighborhood that's growing and developing, so that it'd be a good place for them to live. And then it started to expand to other segments of the population of people that are blind or visually impaired. So, there's a lot of components that go into what conceived this project and what will make it something that's really special for a whole variety of people.
100%. And I want to recap everything you've all said and kind of point out my favorites in it all too. So I think all in all, this project is a beautiful case example of how we can collaborate with both professional and lived experiences, right? And I think that and giving it equal weight. Without the lived experiences of people with visual impairment, we wouldn't generate those insights that would feed the design of this project, right? And without the professionals that are also involved, all of you, and plus occupational therapists, right? And we wouldn't be able to also make those insights actionable. So I think in that sense, it's a beautiful example in co-creation, which, we see in practice a lot in product design, service design, but we don't necessarily see this type of diverse collaborations in the real estate space a lot. So it's in that sense, I love this project so much, and which is why I want to share with all cities and local governments. Second, I love that you highlighted inclusive design doesn't necessarily have to come with a premium tag, right? Sure, we could innovate something from scratch and that would require some investment. That's a different story. But I think budget and timeline typically are used as more excuse to not do anything different, because even if you want to do 50 things and you can't do all 50, you could still do maybe 10, 5 out of that, right? And it's fine, because in the end, what we're doing now is kind of the first prototype, right? Ideally, we continue to iterate it, we figure out, we streamline it more to see how this becomes more cost effective and efficient. And then over time, we scale it in a much better way. So how we start off today is not necessarily, it doesn't anchor us in how we're going to continue forever. So whatever we can do is okay within the budget we have. So I love that, you kind of brought that up, and basically holding us designers, architects also accountable to not make budget and timeline as an excuse, but there's always room to co-create and research and incorporate design principles that are inclusive. And also, and I think, David, we talked about this before with you a little bit too, in any other field or industry, we have more of the concept of prototyping, right? Like we come out with something, we can acknowledge that, we can aspire to be universally accessible, but maybe it won't be, right? Because inclusive design is not necessarily universal design, but as we iterate, we can be more and more inclusive because we're going to learn from each project. And I think this is also a great way, through everything that you mentioned, Janet, the ongoing engagement and education that will happen in this space, and that will enable further community feedback and continuing co-creation. It kind of creates not only just like housing, but a platform to inform how this can evolve in the future. And so in this way, I think it's like a beautiful combination of all of the above, of like what should happen to create more inclusive built environment. And obviously this coming as like an affordable development too is so important because of the demographic that we're serving here. But also pointing out, it comes with tremendous collaboration, also both public-private, diverse expertise, diverse lived experiences to be able to realize this. But we do really need to kind of master the way of working like this too, so we could scale these solutions throughout the country. So in that sense, it's like everything is like coming together beautifully in this project, and no wonder it's getting so much attention. And I really do hope it inspires all other cities and nonprofits too to take initiative and see how they can lead such a conversation. And David to kind of like mentor all developers in this.
Oh yeah. If you've met developers, they're not mentorable, so that they'll have their own ideas.
I second that. I just want to say, Pinar, that David, part of the reason that we wanted to work with David too, he rebuilt areas of Chicago that needed rebuilding in Garfield Park, and he created beautiful spaces. And affordable housing, he defines affordable housing and that it should be beautiful and part of the community. And that's our building. Jack and the team have designed an incredibly beautiful building. And so we're very proud of that aspect of it.
Yes.
Yeah. Our firm's motto is good design is for everyone. And it seems like the most basic thing you could possibly say, but if you can stick to that, I think you can go really far.
And we're pretty picky, and Jack has been very patient. We had a list of what we'd love, like you want in your own home, and then what we could live with, but is still beautiful. So, there's a trade-off, but still beautiful.
No, it's all for the positive, I would say. You'd rather have engagement and attention and, kind of love for the project than just passing it through. So
I've never seen a project actually where, I don't know, Pinar, do you want us to just free discuss?
Yeah, obviously, yes.
Where you're designing it for people that are visually impaired and blind, but we paid more attention to lighting and light because of how critical that is for people that are visually impaired, especially, and even for blind people. So for natural light, you have to be careful about glare. So you don't want too much glare for those folks because it hurts them, but you want enough light in a room that they can feel comfortable. Normal lighting in all the spaces, we need stronger incandescent lights so that they can see contrast. Mm-hmm. So in the buildings, in the hallways, Jack, maybe you want to talk a little bit about how much attention we pay to what's on the floor and on the walls, and then I'll pass it on to you in a second. I just want to say, and so that's sight. And think about all your senses that we pay attention to. Feel is an important part of a building, so we texture the walls so people that are blind can track where they're going instead of just using their canes and moving things. So that had to be paid attention to. I won't say that smell was a conscious thing, but we ventilate these buildings really quite well because people that are blind are really sensitive to smells, and they don't really like that to infiltrate their system sometimes. Nothing for taste, so I don't think that's
that will come with the coffee.
That can be in the cafe,
or like the retail. Yeah.
But we also think about how the units get designed, because the I guess the general idea is that bigger's better. But for people that are blind or visually impaired, bigger's not better. You know, if you drop an earring on the ground in a big old apartment, it's hard to find. You know, you chop a fork in a huge kitchen, it's hard to find. So people that are blind or visually impaired typically like their spaces to be, you know, not small, but compact. So we had to be sensitive to that, and edges and turns, and how the space lays out, and then also how the appliances are accessed, and what kinds of appliances that we use. So there maybe, you know, Jack and Janet, because Janet and her crew had a lot of input into this, might want to talk about some of those design elements that we really focused on, which again are not super expensive, but require a lot of attention and thought.
Yeah, I think it's exactly what you said, David. It's layers of attention, but not cost. I mean, I think contrast is a word that when we're talking about this project, you know, it's just repeated over and over and over again, because it does help with wayfinding and use of the space. As you're walking down the hallway, for example, there's, you know, the edges of the walls are marked both by the trim, and the flooring changes as you get closer to the wall. Units are marked at the floor level and on the walls with changing color. The door is a contrasting color. The door frame is a contrasting color. The sign is contrasting and has braille and is also lit separately. The door knob is a darker color. You know, so it's, you can start to see that just the unit entry has all these pieces that will get you there and make the use more easy, more intuitive. And that just carries through kind of every decision. When we're doing kitchen cabinets, you know, what is our floor that leads up to it? Our floor then has a foot of a different color as it hits the cabinet to say, hey, we're getting closer to the cabinets. The cabinet box is a darker color. The countertop is a lighter color, you know, and you keep doing this contrast just to make it all make a little bit more sense and be a little bit simpler. And then again, David mentioned like reflectivity, you know, thinking about texture of surfaces and not a lot of glare. You know, we spent, Janet, a lot of time on countertops, and there's some really beautiful countertops out there that have all this kind of glittery, you know, this kind of granite kind of feel. And it's like, no, this doesn't work. You know, this isn't, you know, it's maybe a little higher end and we can afford it, but it's not going to serve our, you know, our group that well. So even as simple as electric receptacles are, you know, are dark on a light wall. You know, I think control of natural light, David mentioned, giving multiple options on allowing some light through, but keeping privacy, or you can throw it all the way open, you know, if you just want to feel the sun, but you have those options.
Oh,
So
Jack, I didn't know the electrical receptacles. That's a great idea.
Yeah,
I didn't come up with that. That's good.
it's all receptacles, switches. Yeah, you know, and honestly, David, there's a penny's cost on that, but it's one of those things that's like,
Oh yeah,
it's so smart, right? It's so simple.
Yeah.
It really helped.
No,
Go ahead, Janet.
no, and even the wallpaper that's brailled. And some of these elements were a little higher cost, but the Lighthouse was willing to, because we wanted them so badly, we were going to fundraise specifically for those elements because it's so important to the feel of the building and critical for our people. In addition, occupancy sensors. Some people have said, well, why do you have occupancy sensors? Do people who are blind want the lights on? Of course they want the lights on. And as David said, light can be such an important guide for a person who has minimal vision, and a dark from light environment is so important. So the critical thinking that went into this, I'm so impressed with Jack, who has an understanding and willingness to learn about these elements and about specifics to those with visual impairment. Because I don't think Jack had a lot of background with visual impairment, with other disabilities perhaps, but to learn the environment and what was essential in the environment of a person with a visual impairment was pretty impressive, and the willingness to be brought up to speed. And the point about the countertops was, they're so beautiful and fashionable, the white countertops, but with the glitter and in the quartz and the granite, you couldn't identify something. If you drop something on the counter, you wouldn't be able to find it. So those difficulties and the thought that went into it, it was not hard because it was a labor of love.
Now, I want to tell you something that the reason I'm involved with this in the beginning is my son's blind. He's 26 years old. And what we used to do in our other developments, since the only accessible requirement was to have Braille on the doors and on common spaces, is I would hire him, even at age 8, to walk the building and check every Braille sign. And one day he went to a police station, a brand new police station in our city. They were giving him a tour. And because he was used to doing that, he reached for everything in the Braille on the walls. And 4 of the Braille signs in the police station were wrong, including the women's and men's bathroom. And he laughed so hard to say, they're all wrong. They're going to go in the wrong bathroom.
Amazing. I mean, I think kids are the best co-creators. They're, first of all, brutally honest about their feedback. So it's I'm so glad you involved them very early on and get that brilliant insight. But
That's
also, but also pointing it out, the nuances you have in your project, and how you, for example, mentioned, Jack, the biggest thing that kept coming up is contrast, right? Because I think there's a general, and this is kind of also done even in other industries, we see this, right? The use of Braille is used to oh, we made this accessible, right? It just became a cover to just do that. Well, meanwhile, only 10% of the community read Braille. And there's so much more to it too, right? You can't solve all problems with Braille necessarily. Lighting, the fact that you're talking about color contrast and lighting are such beautiful insights, because it is also with lighting, lighting matters so much, even for our own mental health, right? The importance of natural light, and there's more and more publications around it, within trauma-informed design practice, within neurodiversity, cognitive differences, right? All of that, there's so much that can be done with natural elements we have in the world. And so I think it goes back to what you were saying, Janet, in terms of what matters most here is the critical thinking and the willingness to learn and try something different, right?
Yes.
And also that doesn't add onto budget to try and try to learn and see how you might incorporate that, right? I think we kind of have that responsibility as whoever are the project makers to kind of see how spaces can be more inclusive. It does come with that, community engagement, co-creation need, of course, right? We can't necessarily decide things on our own. We will never know. We will never have all the insights for all community members. The 15%, I think maybe it's 20% now of US population identifies as disabled. And that comes with massive diversity within the population. There's no way we will know all the disability implications and what that might mean physically or mentally. So this type of ongoing willingness to learn and researching and collaborating as we're designing to is all we can do, and only way we can also make something different and meaningful for communities. And I love that the project itself has insights into other areas that could benefit from incorporation of inclusive design principles, veterans housing, senior living, schools, right? When we talk about accessibility, when we broaden that up, it helps, to your point, Jan, the aging population, but as well as kids, right? So there's a lot of learnings we can take from this project that is analogous research for other areas too. So thank you so much for just making this happen and setting an example to the world, really.
Well, I don't know if we still have time, but I'll tell you one other thing. If you look at the design of the building, which sits on the campus of the Lighthouse, it will look like a lighthouse at night, the way the lighting is around the building. And one of the reasons that I thought that seems oh yeah, well, of course, why not do that? But we were in the middle of the medical district, which really has not allowed much rental housing. And also, we wanted a way to be very inviting into the medical community, but also to allow the Lighthouse to, announce what they've done, because there's such an institution into the community. So the materials and the design and they're also subtle enough. So it's not like this
Yeah.
huge lighthouse that's going to light up Lake Michigan.
Yeah. You go there. You go live there.
Right. It's just subtle enough that I think it will send a message to people like, wow, what's that? And then trigger a discussion for people who look at it and start to understand maybe what's happening there, which is not common in affordable housing projects. Normally, people want to hide affordable housing projects, because they're controversial in a lot of communities.
Exactly.
But in this case, I think it was very thoughtful on the part of, Land and Bone and Baker to come up with this design, which obviously the folks at the Lighthouse approved.
Yeah, and I can't wait for myself and for the audience to see it and take a tour and join some of the educational maybe programming, Janet, that you mentioned, to learn more as well once it comes to life. I do want to be mindful of time, so we're going to do a quick sprint of advice, right? And you can frame it in a way for anyone who wants to make progress or push boundaries in any field that they're in. What would you advise them? Whoever wants to go first.
Just jumping in on the design side, I think you kind of hit on it, Pinar, but the idea of taking on the population that you're serving, the people you're serving, as a mission, I think sometimes especially in our kind of part of the field, you can get pretty locked into zoning minimums, accessibility requirements, and I think trying to free your brain up a bit and really attack it and push, and that helps when you have great people like Janet and David pushing along with you instead of in the other direction. But it's totally rewarding. I think this is a kind of a career defining project for myself and others in the office. I think so. It's kind of parroting what you said, but I think it's just true. Just really attack it, take it on.
And I'll go next to give Janet the last word. Okay. I tell people my words of advice are, when they think about what they want to do with their careers, think about the three big components of your work, which are, there's wealth mean most to you, is intellectual challenge means most to you, or does social impact mean most to you? And I would encourage anyone who's at any of the extremes to move to the middle a little bit, and to make sure they keep a balance in their lives, especially if you happen to be towards the wealth piece. Keep some balance. Because one of the things that I love about affordable housing, it's right in the middle. And it certainly provides challenges and rewards in a lot of different ways for those of us who are in the industry. But that's would be my words of advice to those folks.
Love that. It's beautiful. Janet?
Yes, no, my words of advice, just be persistent. And even when you have obstacles and things look difficult, you can get beyond it. Bringing people together and having rational discussions, and because you will have skeptics. You will have skeptics, and you will have to address those issues, but it can be done. And just, as I mentioned, be persistent. And because it is worth it in the end. Look at the joy that's bringing to all of us, but more importantly, it's providing a home to so many people, which is really what life is all about. If you have a good home, then you have solid ground. And this building will be a beacon of that social impact in so many different ways.
I love all of this. I love, stay true to the community, right? Attack it further. I love meet in the middle and balance all those I guess different assets, and also persistence, and there will always be skeptics. So just keep at it. I love it. Thank you so much, everyone. This was such a treat. And thank you for all the work that you do. We'll definitely continue to follow the project. We will show this project in this episode as well and provide links. But I encourage everyone to also follow through and we can't wait to see this work to scale into other cities and really also influencing the work with other communities in the country. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is fun. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.